Before a Spartan warrior ever touched a spear, he had to conquer the most dangerous battlefield of all, his own mind. Imagine the scene, if you will. The pre-dawn light bleeds across the Spartan valley, casting long, jagged shadows against the crags of Mount Taygetos. The air is razor-sharp, biting into the skin with an intensity that demands total submission. A young initiate stands knee-deep in the freezing currents of the Eurotas River. His breath hitches, escaping in frantic, jagged clouds of white vapor. His muscles, barely hardened by the rigors of the Agoge, tremble violently, not from fear of an enemy, but from the raw, primitive rebellion of a nervous system screaming to escape the cold. In the ancient world, many city-states relied on the weight of their gold or the height of their walls. But Sparta understood a deeper, more brutal truth. Walls crumble, and gold is stolen. The only fortification that truly holds against the tides of history is an ironclad nervous system. While other civilizations sought comfort and the decadence of excess, the Spartan architects of war realized that true power lay in the mastery of internal stillness. To them, the ability to remain calm while the body endured extreme physical duress was not just a discipline, it was the essential foundation of their dominance. Why did the Spartan phalanx hold when the earth shook with the weight of invading armies? Why did they succeed where others crumbled into panic and ruin? The answer lies in their radical approach to the human biology of stress. They didn't just train for war, they trained to override the very biological impulses that lead a man to shatter under pressure. In the silence of the river, beneath the watchful gaze of the elders, this boy wasn't just learning to endure the cold. He was learning to command his own heartbeat. He was learning to be the master of his own internal dominion, preparing for a life where a single flickering moment of hesitation, just one, right, would be the difference between eternal glory and total annihilation. History casts the Spartan as a statue carved from granite, a creature devoid of pulse, heart, or shadow. We are told they were born cold, forged in the fires of Mount Taygetus, and destined to die without a flicker of hesitation. But this is a sanitized fiction, a myth constructed to obscure a far more harrowing reality. The Spartan was not born an iron-blooded killer. He was a human being subjected to the most rigorous, systematic dismantling of the nervous system ever recorded in the ancient world. To understand the warrior, you must look beyond the gleaming bronze and the crimson cloaks. You must look at the Agoge, the state-sponsored crucible that did not merely train men, but systematically eradicated the biological wiring of fear. A young Spartan boy was not groomed to be brave in the sense that he suppressed his terror. He was he was essentially forced to treat terror as an obsolete biological error. From the moment he was torn from his mother's side, his world became a relentless sequence of deprivation. Hunger was his tutor, physical exhaustion his constant companion, and the lash of the whip was the rhythmic beat to which his life was set. This wasn't just about building muscle, it was about remapping the pathways between the brain and the body. By starving the boy, they taught him to ignore the ravenous demands of his stomach. By forcing him to march through the jagged, freezing passes of the Peloponnese with nothing but a single garment, they forced his nervous system to stop screaming for comfort. They weren't training soldiers to fight. They were training them to override the amygdala, the primitive lizard brain that dictates our fight-or-flight response. When a normal man stares into the abyss of certain death, his pulse hammers against his ribs, his breath hitches, and his vision narrows. The Spartan was conditioned to respond to that same physiological surge with a chilling, artificial calm. They were taught that fear was a social contagion, a weakness that could crumble a phalanx from within. If you flinched, you were less than human. If you hesitated, you were a threat to the state. This wasn't a choice, right? It was a mandatory evolution. But while the Greeks outside of Laconia whispered of these men as monsters, there was a secret hidden beneath this veneer of absolute control. Because if a man spends his entire existence suppressing the very sensations that make him human, what happens to the psyche when the battle ends and the silence returns? We assume they were machines because we see the result, but we have ignored the psychological fracture mines that must have run deep beneath the skin of every Spartan. And yet, there was one specific brutal exercise, a rite of passage so clandestine that even the historians of the time struggled to document it without trembling, that proved the Spartans weren't hiding their fear, but burying it somewhere few dared to look. The transformation of a Spartan boy into a lethal instrument of the state did not begin on the battlefield. It began in the mind of the lawgiver, Lycurgus. To truly understand the Spartan psyche, one must look past the bronze shields and the crimson cloaks to the very architecture of their society. Lycurgus understood a fundamental truth, a truth that would haunt modern civilizations for centuries. To build an unbreakable state, you must first dismantle the individual. At the heart of this radical social experiment was the Agoge, a state-mandated crucible of character. But the real genius, if one can call such cold, calculated cruelty genius, lay in the mentor-student dynamic. A young Spartan was not merely raised by his kin, he was assigned a mentor, an older warrior whose duty was to strip away the soft edges of empathy and replace them with the sharp, unyielding steel of communal duty. This was not mentorship in the way we understand it today. It was a psychological forge. The mentor was expected to watch the boy endure hunger, cold, and physical brutality, not with the instinct to protect, but with the clinical detachment of a craftsman observing a blade being hammered into shape. They were teaching the youth that the only heartbeat that truly mattered was the rhythmic, collective pulse of the phalanx.
Empathy was viewed as a luxury, a dangerous distraction that could cost a man his life, or worse, his honor. By shifting the emotional focus from family to the brotherhood of arms, the leadership ensured that every citizen was a controlled, predictable instrument. They were effectively, rewiring the human nervous system to respond to commands rather than impulses. Yet there is a haunting question that remains buried in the dust of the Tagetos Mountains. What became of the fragments of the boys they used to be? When the mentor looked into the eyes of his student, did he see the reflection of his own suppressed humanity? Or was the erasure so complete that only the state remained? There was a specific quiet moment in this training, a transition point between boyhood and the status of an equal, where the mask of the Spartan soldier threatened to crack. It was a secret ceremony of silence, right? And it was here that the most elite leadership held the true key to their control. But that secret, it was far more insidious than the violence of the training field, and it held a consequence that would eventually bring the entire system to its knees. The Agoge was not merely a military academy. It was a crucible designed to incinerate the civilian and forge the machine. To understand the Spartan, you must understand their mastery over the nervous system, a radical physiological rewiring. They viewed the human instinct for fight or flight as a defect, a chaotic response that clouded the judgment of a warrior. To overcome it, they employed the Agoge protocol, a terrifyingly methodical immersion into sensory extremes. Imagine the dawn in the Eurotas Valley, the air biting and thin.
The boys were stripped to the bone, forced to endure the shivering cold, not as a punishment, but as a deliberate, calculated thermal shock. By repeatedly exposing the body to freezing temperatures, followed by the blistering heat of the sun, they forced the autonomic nervous system to surrender its reactivity. This was the first layer of conditioning, teaching the body to maintain composure while the heart hammered against the ribs like a trapped bird. But cold was only the beginning. The Spartan instructors utilized sensory deprivation, days spent in total isolation, buried in the suffocating silence of the rugged mountains. In that stillness, the mind begins to scream, searching for stimuli that are no longer there. It was here, in this internal void, that the recruits were introduced to the final component, rhythmic, low-frequency chanting. The sound was not melodic, it was a pulse, a vibration designed to sync with the heartbeat. This was the birth of predatory calm. They were systematically training themselves to move from the frantic, jagged adrenaline of a common soldier into a state of absolute, chilling ataraxia. It was a meditative grace in the face of certain death. Under the guidance of the overseers, the recruit learned to dampen his own physiological alarms. By the time they entered the phalanx, they were no longer operating on instinct. They were operating on an engineered, icy focus that rendered them immune to the chaos of the battlefield. It was a transformation so profound, so utterly complete, that it seemed almost supernatural to their terrified enemies.
Yet there was a hidden danger in this detachment. By stripping away the reactive self, the Spartans were creating a psychological void that needed to be filled. They had conquered their nerves, right? But in doing so, they had unleashed something far more unstable, a shadow that would haunt their society until its final days. And it all centered on a single, ritualistic test of endurance that the history books rarely dare to describe in detail. The narrow pass of Thermopylae was not merely a tactical bottleneck, it was an altar. As the Persian juggernaut poured into the corridor, they did not find a panicked rabble of defenders. They found the Spartans. 300 men standing in a stillness so absolute it defied the very laws of human biology. The heat of the Greek sun shimmered off their bronze shields, yet behind the masks the air was cold. You see, you must understand, this was not courage in the sense we use the word today. It was the fruit of a lifetime of conditioning. In the final, fatal hours, as the walls of the Persian forces closed in, the Spartan heart rate did not spike. Their nervous systems, recalibrated through years of institutionalized hardship, had effectively decoupled from the instinct of self-preservation. Look closely at the psychology of that final stand. They stood in the dust of the mountain, surrounded by the impending end, yet their movements were rhythmic, almost robotic. They were performing a ritual. Softly, they cleaned their spears with the same methodical precision they used to comb their hair before the battle. I mean, this wasn't bravado. It was a complete psychological mastery over the adrenaline response. By suppressing the fight-or-flight mechanism, they had effectively turned their own bodies into instruments of war, unburdened by the crushing weight of fear. But here is where the shadows grow long. To reach this level of discipline, to erase the very instinct that keeps a man alive, requires a sacrifice of the soul. The Spartans achieved a near-perfect tactical stillness, but they had paid for it with the total erosion of their individuality. As the spears broke and the shields buckled, the men standing at that pass were no longer husbands, sons, or brothers. They were vessels for a state that viewed their deaths as the ultimate utility. Even as they fell, the transition between their life and their legacy was seamless, because for the Spartan, there was no self left to grieve. Yet as the sun set over the bodies of the fallen, a chilling question remains. Was this the ultimate expression of human potential, or was it the moment where discipline finally curdled into something much darker? But the mystery of the 300 doesn't end with the blood on the rocks. You know, there was a secret protocol they followed during those final hours, a specific, haunting final command issued by Leonidas that would have changed the course of everything had it been discovered by the enemy. The silence that followed the fall of Leonidas was not merely the absence of battle, it was the sound of a total structural collapse. For centuries, you know, Sparta had operated like a perfectly wound clock, a civilization that treated the human nervous system as raw material to be forged, hardened, and locked into a singular, rigid frequency. By suppressing every impulse that did not serve the state, fear, grief, love, and even the simple drive of individual ambition, the Spartans achieved a terrifying level of operational efficiency. But history, right? History is rarely kind to systems that refuse to bend.
When the environment shifted, when the sheer weight of their own rigid dogma collided with a changing Hellenic world, the cracks began to show. By forcing their citizens to function as mere gears in a machine, the Spartans had accidentally engineered their own fragility. A machine can be incredibly fast and powerful, but it cannot improvise. When the Persians and later the Thebans stopped fighting by the outdated rules of phalanx warfare, the Spartan discipline suddenly became a liability. They were masters of a predictable, closed system, but they were utterly unprepared for the unpredictable, fluid chaos of a modernizing world. Consider the aftermath. As the population of full-blooded citizens began to dwindle, the state found itself unable to adapt its social protocols. They clung to the same brutal training methods and archaic laws, while their enemies were learning, evolving, finding ways to circumvent the Spartan blockade. The very thing that made them legends, that ironclad, unshakable nervous regulation, eventually became a suffocating cage. They had trained a generation to be statues of granite, but in a world that had started to move like water, the granite did not shift. It simply shattered. The irony is palpable. The Greeks of other city-states, who had once looked upon the Spartan discipline with a mixture of reverence and terror, began to notice the hollowness within the city-state's borders. The Spartan internal life, once so tightly controlled, had become a graveyard of suppressed human potential. When the reality of their decline finally set in, there was no emotional resilience left to rebuild, only the cold, mechanical repetition of a tradition that no longer held power. But we must ask ourselves, what happens to a civilization when it suppresses the human variable for so long that it forgets how to evolve? Was this collapse an inevitable consequence of their ideology, or were there specific, hidden maneuvers within their own leadership that accelerated the descent? It wasn't just a loss on the battlefield, you see. It was a systemic failure of identity that even today remains a chilling warning to anyone who believes that total order is the ultimate answer. However, there was one specific, overlooked detail in the final records of their council that suggests the fall was far more calculated and far more sinister than the historians ever dared to admit. The dust of millennia has settled over the ruins of the Eurotas Valley, but the vibration of the Spartan soul still echoes in the marble halls of history. We look back at these men, not as mere relics trapped in bronze and blood, but as the architects of a discipline that transcends the centuries. You see, their legacy was never truly found in the territory they held, nor in the shields they raised against the tide of history. It was found in the silent, unrelenting command of the self. To walk the path of the Spartan is not to seek war, but to master the internal battlefield.
In an age of endless distraction and fractured focus, the Spartan mental reset serves as our blueprint for true resilience. It is the ability to stand in the eye of the storm, to breathe in the chaos, and to choose one's response with the surgical precision of an artisan. They proved that the most formidable empire one can ever build is the one within. You too face an unconquered frontier. It does not lie across a mountain range or behind an opposing phalanx, but within the landscape of your own nervous system. The triggers, the anxieties, and the impulsive reactions that govern modern life, well, these are the shadows that retreat before the light of focused, disciplined intent. The Spartans stripped away the unnecessary to reveal the essential. They understood that power is not how much you possess, but how much you can master. The question that remains, carved into the very foundation of our shared story, is simple yet terrifying. When the world demands your reaction, will you be a creature of impulse or a master of your own internal citadel? How will you claim dominion over your own mind, starting today? If this glimpse into the ancient discipline has struck a chord, join us as we continue to unearth the wisdom of the lost ages. Subscribe to Hidden Epoch Narratives, and together let us keep the fire of antiquity burning in the modern world.